From the moment Samuel could speak, his father had already chosen the words for him. Yes, Father. That was the phrase every lesson ended with. It wasn't just a response, it was a rule. A seal of obedience, a confirmation that Samuel understood his place in the world, in the house, and in the shadow of the man who demanded perfection. Their home was quiet, not in a peaceful way, but in the heavy silence that comes from fear of breaking something invisible. The wooden floors creaked too loudly. The ticking of the old wall clock felt like a warning. Every sound seemed to remind Samuel that silence was safety, that speaking without purpose was dangerous. His father, Richard Hale, was a man carved from discipline, a former soldier turned schoolteacher whose posture never bent and whose tone never wavered. He believed in order. He believed that strength was built through obedience and that softness was the enemy of growth. His rules filled the house like air, invisible, constant, impossible to escape. His mother, Evelyn, tried to soften things. She smiled gently at her son from across the dinner table, her eyes pleading, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eat, sweetheart." But even she spoke as if afraid of echoing too loudly. Her tenderness existed only in moments, in the way she'd straighten Samuel's collar when his father wasn't looking, or leave a small note in his lunchbox with a drawing of the sun and a heart. But when his father was present, the world shifted. Richard's voice would fill the room, and even the sunlight seemed to stand still. "Sit up straight, Samuel." "Yes, Father." "Look at me when I speak to you." "Yes, Father." "Did you understand what I said?" "Yes, Father." Every question had one answer, and Samuel learned quickly that hesitation was a kind of disobedience. At 8 years old, Samuel was already the perfect image of what his father wanted him to be: neat, polite, silent, efficient. His school notebooks were immaculate. His bed was made with military precision. He walked with his shoulders squared, mimicking the man whose approval he desperately sought but rarely received. Sometimes he'd stand in front of the mirror before school, repeating to himself, "I'm not weak. I'm not soft. I'm not a disappointment." The words were heavy on his small tongue, but he said them anyway, because that's what his father said every time Samuel cried. He learned to hide his tears well. The neighbors admired the Hale family. They saw the neat yard, the polite boy, the respectable father. "You're raising him right," they'd say to Richard, and Richard would nod with quiet pride, a faint smile on his lips. But Samuel knew the truth. Right didn't mean happy. One evening when Samuel was 9, he broke a glass at dinner. It slipped from his hand, shattering across the floor like thunder in the silence. He froze. His mother flinched. His father didn't move at first, just stared. "Samuel," Richard said, his tone eerily calm, "what did I say about carelessness?" Samuel's heart pounded. I'm sorry, Father. It was an accident." "Accidents happen when the mind isn't disciplined," his father said, standing slowly. He took Samuel's wrist, firm but not yet painful. "You must learn to control your hands, your thoughts, yourself." That night, Samuel was told to kneel beside the shards until the clock struck 9. The light faded, the room darkened. His knees hurt, but he didn't move. Every time he flinched, his father's voice cut through the air. "Stillness builds strength." He whispered the words again and again to himself. "Stillness builds strength." And somewhere between the pain and the silence, he believed it. That's how obedience became worship. As the years passed, Samuel began to mistake fear for respect. The more he obeyed, the more distant his father became, as if perfection was supposed to earn love, but love was never the prize. What his father offered instead was approval, rare, cold, and brief. Sometimes late at night, Samuel would hear his parents arguing quietly behind closed doors. His mother's voice would break, soft and trembling. "He's just a child, Richard. He needs kindness, not orders." And his father's voice would answer, low, firm, and final. "The world won't be kind to him. I'm preparing him to survive it." Samuel never saw his mother cry, but he could hear it in her silence afterwards, the way her footsteps grew slower, the way her smile became smaller. By 12, Samuel no longer cried at all. He had learned that emotions were like broken glass, dangerous if left unattended. He had learned that comfort was weakness. He had learned that love was something to be earned. But something began to shift that year. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but curiosity, a flicker of thought he wasn't supposed to have. One day, his teacher at school, Mrs. Dawson, said something that lingered in his mind. "You don't always have to agree, Samuel. Sometimes it's brave to say no." It was a small sentence meant gently, but it echoed in him for days. He tried to imagine saying no to his father. The word itself felt dangerous, foreign. What would happen if he didn't say, "Yes, Father"? What if just once he didn't obey? He didn't realize it then, but that tiny thought, that spark of defiance, was the beginning of the end. Because obedience once cracked can never be fully repaired. Samuel was 13, the first time he didn't say, "Yes, Father." It happened so quietly that even he didn't recognize it as rebellion. His father had told him to rewrite his essay. The handwriting is weak. A strong mind shows in strong lines. Samuel, exhausted from a full day of school and chores, had simply nodded instead of answering. It was such a small thing, just silence. But in their home, silence carried meaning. Richard Hale noticed. He always noticed. He looked at his son for a long, heavy moment, the kind of stare that could cut through air. "Did you hear me?" he asked finally. "Yes, Father," Samuel said quickly, too quickly, but the delay had already happened. The damage was done. That night, when the house was dark, Richard entered his son's room. He didn't shout, he didn't strike, he simply stood in the doorway, his shadow long and sharp against the wall. Discipline is something you practice only when convenient. It's who you are, every hour, every breath. "Yes, Father." But as Richard left, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Something in him felt different. It wasn't anger, not yet, just an awareness that he had power. A small, dangerous power. The ability to withhold obedience. In school, Samuel began to notice things he had never seen before. Laughter, freedom, softness. His friends teased each other without fear. They slouched in their chairs. They made mistakes and shrugged them off. And when a teacher scolded them, it ended there. No echoes followed them home. He envied them, but more than that, he didn't understand them. How could they live without rules holding them together? One afternoon, his friend Owen invited him over. Samuel hesitated. He knew his father didn't like him wasting time, but his mother encouraged it. "Go," she whispered. "You need to see the world outside these walls." At Owen's house, everything was loud. His father laughed from the kitchen. His mother sang along with the radio. The smell of burnt cookies filled the air, and instead of punishment, there was laughter. When Owen accidentally spilled juice on the counter, his mother just smiled. "Grab a towel, buddy." No shouting, no threats, no lectures, just warmth. Samuel felt like an intruder in another universe. That night, when he returned home, the silence of his own house felt heavier than ever. He started to question things, small things at first. Why his father never said thank you. Why he never smiled when Samuel brought home good grades. Why everything Samuel did right was expected,
and everything he did wrong was remembered. But the real break, the one that changed everything, came on a rainy Sunday afternoon. Samuel was working in the study, copying paragraphs from an old textbook for punishment for carelessness in his chores. His father sat nearby, reading the newspaper. The sound of the pen scratching against paper was the only noise. Then Richard said, without looking up, "Stand up straight, Samuel, you're slouching." Samuel froze. His back straightened instinctively, but something in him cracked. He had been sitting for hours. His hand ached, his head hurt, and all for a mistake so small he barely remembered it. "I am sitting straight," he muttered before he could stop himself. His father looked up, eyes cold and calm. "What did you say?" Samuel's throat got dry. He could feel his pulse in his temples. I said I'm sitting straight, Father." The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard rose slowly, folding the newspaper with deliberate precision. "You're speaking back now." Samuel wanted to take it back. He wanted to rewind time. But something deep inside, something that had been quiet for too long, refused to let him. "I just wanted to say I wasn't slouching." Richard stepped closer, eyes cold and calm. "When I tell you something, you don't argue. You listen." "I was just explaining." The sharp crack of Richard's hand across the desk silenced him. Not a strike, a warning, but it echoed like thunder. "Obedience," Richard said softly, "is not up for discussion." Samuel stared at the table, trembling. His voice shook when he spoke. "Why can't I ever say what I feel?" Richard's expression didn't change, because feelings cloud judgment. You think the world cares how you feel? Samuel looked up, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a father. He saw a man who needed control more than he needed love. That night, he didn't say, "Yes, Father." When Richard ordered him to turn off the lights, he stayed silent, not out of courage, but out of exhaustion. And yet, that silence spoke louder than words ever could. The next morning, the house felt colder. His father didn't look at him at breakfast. His mother's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. She sensed the shift, too, the invisible fracture that had finally split the air between father and son. Days passed, then weeks. Samuel became quieter at home, but more alive at school. He began writing stories, thoughts, questions, and a small notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. His mother found it once, skimmed a few lines, and her eyes filled with tears. She didn't tell Richard. She couldn't, because in those pages, Samuel had written the one thing he could never say out loud. Obedience is not love. It's fear in disguise. And beneath it, in shaky handwriting, "I think I hate him." But hate was too simple a word for what Samuel felt. It was confusion, grief, the slow realization that the man he wanted to love might never change. Then one evening, something happened that would mark the true breaking point. Richard came home early from work. The rain was heavy outside, the kind that drowned all other sound. Samuel was in the living room, watching television, which his father had forbidden on weekdays. When Richard's footsteps echoed down the hallway, his stomach tightened. He quickly grabbed the remote, but the delay was enough. "Samuel," his voice cut through the air like a blade, "what do you think you're doing?" Samuel opened his mouth to explain, to lie, to apologize. He didn't know which. But what came out instead was raw and trembling. "I just wanted to relax, Father. I'm tired." His father stared at him, unmoving. Then quietly, "You don't get to be tired." And for the first time in his life, Samuel didn't look away. Why not? The words hung between them, dangerous, defiant, impossible to take back. Richard stepped forward, his face unreadable. Because you haven't earned it. Samuel's voice rose, tears burning in his eyes. I'm your son, not your soldier. The silence that followed was absolute. It was in that silence that the real war between them began. Not of words, but of wills.
The next few days after Samuel's outburst felt unreal, like the world had slowed down just enough for everyone to sense something shifting beneath the surface. Richard didn't speak to his son, not once. He went to work in silence, came home in silence, ate dinner in silence. But it wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a silence sharp enough to wound. His mother tried to bridge the gap, placing extra bread on Samuel's plate, forcing small smiles, whispering things like, "He'll calm down, sweetheart." But they both knew better. Richard Hale didn't calm down. He decided. And when he finally decided, the consequences were permanent. That Sunday morning, he knocked on Samuel's door. The knock was soft, but it froze the air. Samuel opened it hesitantly, expecting another lecture. Instead, his father said only, "Get dressed. We're going for a drive." No tone, no anger, just that flat, emotionless calm that always meant something serious. The car ride was silent. Outside, gray clouds hung heavy, the kind that promised rain. Samuel watched the landscape blur by, the fences, the distant hills, the world he barely knew. His heart thudded faster the further they drove from town. "Where are we going?" he asked quietly. His father didn't answer for a while. Then finally, "Somewhere you'll learn what responsibility means." They arrived at an old shed on the outskirts of their property, one Samuel had never been inside. It smelled of dust, leather, and oil. Tools hung neatly on the walls, everything arranged with military precision. Richard walked to a small chest near the back. When he opened it, Samuel saw something inside that made his stomach twist. A long, polished wooden cane. It gleamed faintly under the dim light. Samuel stepped back instinctively. "Father," Richard said quietly, "do you remember when I told you that discipline is what separates men from boys?" Samuel's throat tightened. He didn't answer. "I let things slide. I allowed your tongue to grow sharper, your posture weaker, your will defiant." "Please," Samuel whispered, "I didn't mean—" "You did mean it, and that's the problem." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Richard turned toward him. "You've let pride make you forget who you are." Samuel's hand shook. "I'm your son." Richard's eyes darkened. "Then prove it." The air in the shed felt heavy, suffocating. Samuel wanted to run, to scream, to make someone, anyone, stop this. But deep inside, he knew no one was coming. When the first strike came, it wasn't loud. Just a dull, cruel sound that seemed to echo inside Samuel's chest. The pain was blinding, not just physical, but emotional. It was betrayal wrapped in discipline. He didn't cry out, not at first. He had learned long ago that crying made it worse. But by the third strike, his voice broke. "I'm sorry," he gasped. Richard didn't stop. By the fifth, he was sobbing. By the seventh, he couldn't even speak. His apologies came out in broken, choking breaths. Finally, Richard lowered the cane, breathing heavily. "Do you understand now?" Samuel nodded weakly through tears. "Yes, Father." But what he meant was no. Because something had died inside him that could never be repaired. That night, Samuel lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, the same ceiling he had stared at 1,000 times before. But now it looked different, distorted. The silence in the house no longer felt a safety. It felt like a coffin. He tried to convince himself that it was over, that his father had done it for his own good, that he would wake up tomorrow and things would go back to normal. But as days passed, the normal never returned. At school, Samuel stopped talking. He walked through hallways like a ghost. His teachers noticed, but when they called home, Richard assured them everything was under control. When his mother tried to comfort him, he pulled away. He didn't want her pity. He wanted to stop feeling like a mistake. Then came the day of the incident, the day that would make the local paper, though no one would ever truly understand what happened inside that quiet house. It began with a simple conversation.
or what should have been one. Richard came home early again, found Samuel sitting at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched homework. "You haven't started?" Samuel didn't answer. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. Richard's tone hardened. "Samuel?" "I don't want to do it," the boy said softly. Richard blinked. "What did you say?" "I said I don't want to do it." For a moment, Richard just stared at him. Then his face changed, not anger, but disbelief. "You don't want to? Since when do your wants matter more than my rules?" Samuel looked up at him. His eyes were red, but steady. "Since I realized you don't love me." The words hit like a blade. For the first time, Richard looked human, shocked, hurt. But it lasted only a second. Then the mask returned. "You will not speak to me like that. I'm done speaking your way." He turned toward the door, a simple act, a movement toward freedom. But Richard's hand caught his shoulder, not violently, but firmly enough to stop him. "Samuel, stop. Let me go." "Samuel." When Samuel jerked his arm free, he stumbled backward. His foot caught the leg of a chair. The sharp edge of the table met his side. He fell hard. The crash echoed through the house. His mother screamed from the hallway. Richard froze, the color draining from his face. Samuel tried to push himself up, but his body didn't respond. Blood on the edge of the table. The silence that followed was unbearable. Richard dropped to his knees beside him. "Samuel, son, look at me." But Samuel's gaze had already gone distant, unfocused. His lips parted as if to speak, maybe to forgive, maybe to accuse, but no sound came. And just like that, the boy who had spent his life saying, "Yes, Father," took his final breath in silence. The papers would call it a tragic household accident. The neighbors whispered. The church murmured. His mother moved away 2 months later, her heart too broken to stay in that house. Richard Hale never spoke publicly about what happened, but in the small town library, on the last shelf near the back, there appeared a handwritten notebook, the one Samuel used to keep under his mattress. On the final page, written in the shaky hand of a boy who had been trying to make sense of the world, were 6 words that would outlive them both. "Obedience without love is a crime." Some stories don't end with justice. They end with silence and the questions that never leave you. If this story left you thinking, don't forget to subscribe and join us again, where we explore the hidden psychology of discipline, fear, and the moments that define who we become.